Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. So we finished our grand European tour, and now we're back in the brand new United States. Things are busy. The American people, both the movers and the shakers and the everyday people, are trying to build a new country. They're doing it with one foot planted in their colonial traditions and the other stepping boldly into a new national identity. They had just defeated the greatest empire at the time, and maybe the greatest empire in the history of the world. I think the phrase that best captures this moment, and the thing that came right to my mind, is 10 feet tall and bulletproof. That was the energy they had. The revolutionary generation was in their full stride and the height of their power. They weren't just tweaking or adjusting the old system. They were creating a new nation straight off the drawing board. That kind of thing had really never been done before, at least not to this scale. And it wasn't just these elites doing the work, although they were definitely busy with it. The regular people were building too. They were migrating into new areas, crossing the Appalachian Mountains and pushing toward the Mississippi River. It was an expansion in every sense of the word. In this part of our series, we'll look at how the Catholic Church in America grew right along with the new United States. We'll pay particular attention to the church's growth in organization and authority, especially in this critical early phase. Geographically, we're going to focus on the Old Northwest, the Ohio country, and then we'll dip down into Kentucky. I've decided to include Western New York and Western Pennsylvania in this picture as well, and you'll see why in a moment. We'll also talk about geography itself, how it defined and shaped the United States, and we'll take a look at how American religiosity was shifting in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That backdrop helps us see how pivotal the Catholic Church was in this first major phase of growth and expansion in the United States. Before we move on, let's take a minute for a quick note on geography. I think I may have been taking geography for granted, but in early America and really all the way through modern American history, geography has been extremely important. Now, we don't have to get into all the nitty-gritty and beat this point to death, but I think it's worth a nod, especially if you aren't from North America or you're listening to this while you're driving. The original 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic or eastern coast of what we'd call the southern half of the North American continent. Canada, of course, takes up much of the northern half of the eastern seaboard of the continent. As settlers moved westward, the first major obstacle they ran into, major geographical obstacle, was the Appalachian Mountains. And while we're at it, yes, some people might disagree even vociferously with my pronunciation. Some say Appalachian, others say Appalachian. I'll be sticking with the Appalachian pronunciation myself. The Appalachian mountain chain runs all the way from northern Georgia into Atlantic Canada. Fun fact, the chain of mountains that make up the Appalachians is ancient. We're talking Carboniferous era, 300 million years ago ancient. At that time, all of the continents were mashed together into a supercontinent called Pangaea. When Pangaea split, it did so right through the mountains and created the Atlantic Ocean. That means the Appalachians, the Scottish Highlands, and the Atlas Mountains of Northwest Africa are all the same ancient mountain chain. Now, the Appalachians aren't the tallest mountains out there. The highest peak's only about 6,600 feet, or roughly 2,000 meters. Just for comparison, the tallest mountain in the continental U.S. is over 14,000 feet. And the tallest mountain in all of the U.S., Denali or Mount McKinley, there's some controversy in that naming, in Alaska is over 20,000 feet. And not to dive too deeply into geographical controversy, Mauna Kea in Hawaii is also a mountain. A little less than half of the mountain is above sea level. The rest is under the Pacific Ocean. If measured from its base, Mauna Kea is even taller than Mount Everest. But back to the point of all this, the Appalachians weren't impossible to cross, but they weren't easy either, especially in the 1700s and the 1800s. We're talking about rough terrain, deep valleys called hollows or hollers, depending on where you're from, and densely wooded hills. But here's the thing, the land past the mountains, it was great land once you got there. We're talking about what would become the Old Northwest or the Northwest Territories down to Kentucky. Once you made it past the Appalachians, the terrain flattens out and there's more rivers. And those rivers were like super highways. Take Pittsburgh, for example. It was originally the French Fort Duquesne. That location was not random. It sat on the intersection of three major rivers. The French had settled this land beyond the Appalachians, and so had Native American peoples. In fact, Native Americans had always lived in this area. But even Native American groups from the east, particularly the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, expanded their influence into this rich region as well. The Great Lakes system marks the northern boundary of the whole territory. The French exploited the area from both directions, from the north out of Canada and from the south using those river highways. Once you're past the Appalachians, the rivers can take you almost anywhere, north to south, east to west, but there's a catch. There's no direct water route from the British colonies or early U.S. territory in the east out to the west. The French, on the other hand, had an almost direct path from the Atlantic Ocean into the interior of the continent. So you have the Great Lakes going east to west are Ontario, Erie, Huron, Michigan, and Superior. The problem is that the flow of the lakes is from west to east, but more importantly, navigation is blocked between Lake Erie and Ontario by a major landform, the Niagara Escarpment. The Niagara Escarpment runs from Wisconsin on the west side of Lake Superior all the way into central New York. In New York, the escarpment creates a series of beautiful waterfalls, the most famous, of course, being Niagara Falls. Now, here's what matters. French traders and explorers could navigate from the Atlantic down the St. Lawrence River through Lake Ontario and then end up just below Niagara Falls on the Niagara River, which connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. But because of Niagara Falls, they couldn't just sail straight through, so they had to develop a short portage around Niagara Falls. And that really opened up the entire central part of the continent to French trade, missionary work, and exploration. They also had a route that could take them from the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi and reach this area. So really, once they had that portage developed, they could go from French Canada all the way to their holdings in New Orleans. Let's pause our discussion of the Northwest Territories and Near West for just a moment and how they opened up not just to American expansion, but also Catholic expansion. Let's quickly wrap up the rest of North America's geography. As we continue moving west from the Appalachians and the Old Northwest, the new major geographic feature we run into is the Mississippi River. Now, this river is a big one. For water traffic specifically, it was the most important feature for travel and commerce in the United States. It's one of the largest river systems in the entire world, and incredibly, it's navigable almost its entire length from Minnesota near the Canadian border all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River gave us key cities like New Orleans at the southern tip, St. Louis in the middle, and many more up and down its banks. It also collects water from other major rivers, the Ohio River from the east and the Missouri River from the west. These are like the interstate highways of the early U.S., except the freight moved by flatboat, keelboat, and later by steam paddle boats. After the Mississippi River, you hit a huge area of steppe called the Great Plains, and the plains were relatively easy to travel in one way. They were flat and wide open, but the distances were enormous, just endless stretches of land. People could walk across them or travel by covered wagon. It wasn't easy, but it was definitely possible. The wealthy could take a boat down to Panama and cross the Isthmus of Panama by land and then grab a ship up west to the west coast. Or they could also go all the way around the southern tip of South America and never leave the boat. But for a regular traveler, the journey was just by foot or wagon, and it was slow, hard, but definitely doable. Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors. Then you hit the Rockies. The Rocky Mountains are not like the Appalachians. These are serious mountains. The rivers helped people travel and trade in the east, but those rivers ended at the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains had to be crossed through snow-covered passes in the north or by crossing seemingly endless deserts to the southwest. But once you got past the Rockies and they developed the passes, you hit what many Americans thought of as the promised land, California and the Pacific coast. And this became a part of the American dream, that constant expansion westward. That dream, though, wasn't just a dream. It sparked wars with Native American nations, with Mexico, and even internal conflicts. And as we'll see in this series, the Catholic history of the United States will intersect directly with this expansion, especially in the lands that had already been Catholic for centuries before they became part of the United States. Now, if you were an early American settler or maybe a merchant trying to get from the East Coast over the Appalachians to the fertile lands beyond, you'd probably be looking for something a little easier than a wagon train over the steep ridges and muddy trails. This is where the early industrial revolution starts to really get into the story. New technologies and forward-thinking innovators were exploring ways to dramatically increase the efficiency of trade and travel. And I don't really use this lightly. The changes that came with this period were on par with the internet or AI revolutions of our own time. Everything changed. It brought massive benefits and, of course, plenty of disruption. One of the first huge innovations was the canal. Now, in Britain, they were already building canals all over the place to improve inland transportation. The idea made its way across the Atlantic, and the Americans took it seriously. The first viable canal that truly revolutionized east-west travel in the United States was the Erie Canal. At the time, many people thought it was a completely ridiculous idea. Dig a water route from the Hudson River all the way to Lake Erie? That's over 360 miles of rock, swamp, and hills. A huge difference in elevation. Even someone as innovation-friendly as President Thomas Jefferson thought that the idea was somewhere between nonsense and insane. But New York State decided to give it a go. In 1817, they pulled the funding together and started digging. And what they accomplished was nothing short of an engineering marvel. By 1825, they had carved out a 363-mile, 40 feet wide, and 4-foot deep ditch from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. It was named Clinton's Ditch after Governor DeWitt Clinton. But it became a marvel of early American infrastructure. Once completed, barges could float all the way up from New York City, up the Hudson River, through the Erie Canal, and into the Great Lakes, opening up the entire interior of the continent. The cost of shipping plummeted by over 90%. Travel time from Albany to Buffalo dropped from, at the quickest by overland, 2 weeks to just 4 days. Practically overnight, small towns along the route became booming economic hubs. Buffalo transformed into one of the world's most important ports. But it wasn't just goods moving along the canal, people were moving too. And with people came something even more powerful, ideas. This is where we'll pause and take a closer look at the broader religious situation in the United States during this time. We're about to enter one of the most fascinating and really overlooked periods in the American religious story, the Great Awakenings and the rise of what became known as the burned-over district of Western New York. And yes, this really does all connect back to Catholic history, especially as we wrap up this phase of the story and return to the organizational efforts of Bishop John Carroll. There were two what were called Great Awakenings during the period we're covering in this series. Both had monumental impacts on the religious, cultural, and even political direction of the young United States. Let's start with the first Great Awakening, which took place roughly between 1720 and 1740. Now, I know this technically falls just before our immediate time frame, but it's really crucial to understanding what happens later in the story. The first Great Awakening was led primarily by two preachers, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. At the time, religiosity was on the decline in these British colonies. People just weren't showing up to church the way they used to. And the reasons are, in a way, pretty straightforward. There was a shortage of preachers and religious leaders, especially in rural areas. We saw this issue with the Catholic Church at the same time. There was also a growing distrust of institutions in the colony, both religious and governmental. Add in increasing prosperity, and you've got a population that just didn't feel like they needed organization as much anymore. Religion, quite frankly, just wasn't exciting to people. It wasn't connecting with them. But Whitefield and Edwards saw that gap and they stepped in to fill it, and they brought with them something new, a new energy. They tapped into a deep need among the people, preaching in ways that weren't confined to one Christian religious denomination, even though both men were loyal to their own denomination. They spoke directly to the people, and they made religion feel alive again, and their message was simple. There was a God who was angry at sin, but loving and merciful. A God who wanted people to do better and who believed they could, not just through their institutions or clergy, but through people's own efforts and their own communities. And the people responded big time. They came out in thousands to hear Whitefield and Edwards preach. Remember, this was before microphones, speakers, or stages, or any modern amplification. These men preached to huge crowds, sometimes representing a significant percentage of the total number of Catholics in the entire 13 colonies at one time. And that impact was enormous. Both Whitefield and Edwards died before the American Revolution, but their legacies lived on. Whitefield in particular was a close friend with many of the revolutionary leaders, including Benjamin Franklin. Now, Franklin wasn't what we'd call a holy roller or a religious zealot. He leaned more towards deism, but he did pay lip service, at least, to organized Christianity. But Ben was friends with everybody, including our old Orthodox pal, John Paradise. And Ben Franklin recognized the power of what Whitefield and Edwards had unleashed. And it was because of that awakening. It wasn't just religious. It stirred people to action. It helped ignite the spirit that would eventually become the American Revolution. Now that we've laid a little groundwork for the First Great Awakening, it's time to move into what we can call the Great Awakening Part 2, or the Second Great Awakening. This movement kicked off not long after the dust had settled from the American Revolution, around 1795, and different scholars mark the end, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. We won't get into the nitty-gritty of all the arguments over that, and they really don't matter very much. But let's take a high-level look here. These two great awakenings, especially the second, really set the tone religiously, politically, and culturally for the whole 19th century. And if we're honest with each other, the effects echo all the way into our modern day in the U.S. But that's a different series and a different topic. But for our purposes, the Great Awakening created the culture Catholics would find themselves navigating for decades to come. Remember, the Catholic Church was already seen as foreign and something other, and as Catholic immigration boomed, that perception only intensified. So who led the charge in the Second Great Awakening? It was primarily two Protestant groups, the Methodists and the Baptists. In fact, Methodism actually became the largest denomination in the United States during this time. Now, the roots of Methodism go back to the First Great Awakening with figures like John Wesley and an English Anglican reformer. George Whitefield, who we talked about earlier, was actually a close associate of John Wesley. What tied Methodists and Baptists together in this movement was their emphasis on the personal relationship with Jesus and individual salvation. This wasn't about an inherited faith or a church tradition. It was about individual and individualism. Many of these groups leaned towards a theology called Arminianism, which was a reaction against Calvinism. You didn't have to be one of the elect. Anyone could choose salvation. It was your call. That kind of personal freedom really fits hand in glove with American ideals of individualism and self-determination. Now, from a Catholic perspective, this kind of thinking had been addressed centuries earlier in the form of Pelagianism, which shared some ideas with Arminianism. The Western Roman Catholic Church rejected Pelagianism, while the Eastern churches were a bit more inclined towards an idea of free will. Ultimately, neither Arminianism or Calvinism would be accepted by the Catholic Church or Orthodox Church for that matter. Still, the whole idea of free will and personal salvation really shaped the Second Great Awakening. But the real heart of it wasn't just reviving personal faith, it was about reviving society. Revivalists looked around and saw a world just going downhill fast, going down the tubes, you might say. They thought society needed saving, not just individual souls. They believed in a kind of utopia, a shining city on a hill inspired by the book of Revelation. The movement emphasized building a better society, not just better churches, and that drive, fiery and emotional, sometimes frantic, led directly to a whole host of social reform movements. This is where we get ideas like millennialism, the belief that the end of the world was imminent. Preachers started setting specific dates for the end of days. Those dates came and they went, and then more dates were set and they went. Still, the momentum didn't slow down. Out of this era comes dispensationalism, rapture theology, and what might many consider the beginnings of American evangelicalism. And one of the most significant developments was the attention turned toward African Americans and enslaved people of African descent. That was new. It was the birth of Black-led churches, including white congregants being preached to by Black pastors. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, was born and flourished during this time, as it continues to flourish to this day. This was also the birthplace of the abolitionist movement. Up to this point, the traditional Christian view, stretching back all the way to the Paul of Tarsus, saw slavery as a social hierarchy. Slaves were not to be mistreated, and they were to be seen as full brothers in Christ and members of the church. But the institution of slavery itself wasn't questioned. The Catholic Church had helped pretty much eliminate slavery in medieval Europe, but indentured servitude and related systems continued to persist. Papal bulls called out abuses, but rarely condemned slavery as an institution. And let's be honest, many Christians use the Bible as a good dose of self-interest to argue that slavery was actually divinely improved. But the Second Great Awakening turned that on its head. For the first time, people began saying not only should slaves be treated well, but slavery itself as an institution was a moral evil and must be ended. This tension between the Southern slaveholding religious fervor and the Northern abolitionist zeal would become one of and the major force leading to the Civil War. And so let's just take a second to loop back a bit on this issue of slavery. The Founding Fathers knew that slavery did not line up with the Enlightenment ideals that they confessed. But in what I'd like to call one of the greatest failures of the American Revolution, they decided to punt on the issue. Maybe they hoped slavery would just fade away. It did seem in strong decline by the late 1700s. The U.S. had even banned the international slave trade in 1794. In the North, slavery did largely die out, and unfortunately, in many ways replaced by the brutal world of industrial labor, especially for waves of Catholic immigrants who flooded in. That industrial revolution was no paradise for them. But in the South, slavery saw a massive resurgence thanks to technologies like the cotton gin. There were attempts at compromise. Some areas banned slavery, others expanded it. But in the end, there just was no middle ground. Pro-slavery and abolitionist factions viewed each other as threats to their entire way of life, to their salvation. Slavery, more than any other issue, led directly to the Civil War. Catholics were caught in the middle. Their views on slavery largely followed regional lines. Bishops in the South tended to support slavery, while those in the North were more abolitionist. But many of the new Catholic immigrants just simply didn't care about the issue. They were more concerned about their own survival in a hostile, industrializing society. Meanwhile, other social movements, women's rights, prohibition, and others also took on religious and ideological importance. So how did all of this impact the Catholic Church? Well, for the most part, Catholics didn't participate in the Second Great Awakening. The core idea of that movement were fundamentally opposed to Catholic doctrine. This was a movement fueled by anti-clericalism and anti-hierarchy in the Catholic Church, which with its pope and bishops and sacraments and centuries of tradition, the deposit of faith, stood in stark contrast. The notion that salvation didn't require the church or its sacraments, just a personal decision, was completely foreign and antithetical to Catholic theology. So were the ideas of radical individualism and that whole thing of suspicion of religious authority. It just didn't play. Catholic leaders were deeply skeptical of the entire movement. Encyclicals like Mirari Vos showed just how much distrust there was. Add to all that mix was the anti-immigrant attitudes of many Protestant reformers, and you'll understand why Catholics kept their distance. But now with that foundation laid, let's turn to a local example of just how intense this movement became. And the effects of the Second Great Awakening live in America to this day. The Second Great Awakening led to the Third Great Awakening and later revival style movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. This is truly an American phenomenon. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. With that little brief overview of the Second Great Awakening, let's talk about one of the most fascinating and intense religious and social landscapes in early American history, the burned-over district of Western New York. This is where the Second Great Awakening began for the most part, but more than that, it's where it reached its peak, where the flames burn the hottest. The name Burned Over comes from the idea that revival after revival swept through these towns like wildfire, leaving no one untouched. The Erie Canal was a big part of that story. This region went from a quiet backwater to a booming center of commerce practically overnight. Towns that had been just a few buildings or didn't even exist at all turned into magnets for business, industry, and new people. And with these people came ideas and movement and energy. If you drive through any of these towns today, you follow the path of the old Erie Canal, you'll just see glimpses of that former glory. Massive civic buildings, sprawling mansions, and impressive downtowns. You might wonder, why did places like Rochester, Seneca Falls, and Palmyra, Buffalo even get so rich so quickly? The answer is the Erie Canal. And these towns didn't just grow economically, they became the incubators of massive social and religious change. The Burned Over district gave rise to the abolitionist movement, women's right, and the early push for prohibition. Some of the most important names in American reform history lived and worked there. Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They helped shape the identity of the United States in ways that we still feel today. And let's not forget religions that came. Maybe the famous, infamous son of Palmyra, New York, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormonism. Joseph Smith was a product of this world, and he grew up and lived his life and discovered his movement a few miles outside of Rochester in a canal town, or very close to the canal town. The Burned Over district was his launch pad. Eventually, he had to, and he was forced to move on. Like so many others who found the spiritual intensity there overwhelming, he might say. But this is where he gets a start. Even major anti-Masonic movements came out of this region. Now, I want to just take a quick moment to share a little personal history, and that will tie into the greater story. I was born in Buffalo, right on the outer edge of the Burned Over district and the terminus of the Great Erie Canal. And even though I was steeped in Buffalo history, thanks to my uncle, who spent many a dreary Buffalo Saturday dragging me to old buildings, dusty archives, and the Historical Society, we never once even talked about or stumbled across any Burned Over district mementos, you might say, or artifacts. And there was a reason for that, and that's because Buffalo was much more commercial, much more transactional, and in a way much more Catholic than these other areas of the Burned Over district. And that time with him really shaped me and nurtured my love of history and taught me how to spotted in places that others overlook. And I think that that's just a fun activity. The suburbs of Buffalo, though, that was really a totally different story. And that's where you get movements like the Roycrofters and the Oneida movement and these other utopianist groups. This was also major stops for the Underground Railroad. I even learned about the Ebenezers. We would drive through a small suburb of Buffalo called West Seneca, and inside of the suburb of West Seneca is a suburb called the Hamlet of Ebenezer. And I wonder, where did that name come from? And it came from a group of Second Great Awakening people called the Community of True Inspiration that set up all these colonies of Ebenezer all across New York State. Another little town you probably never heard of is called Alden, New York. It was a hub of the Underground Railroad, and as wild as it sounds, it technically seceded from the United States Union during the Civil War. And what's even more bizarre is it wasn't formally readmitted into the Union until after World War II in 1946. So a pretty incredible piece of history. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Am I spending too much on this part of the story? And I don't think so. Find those hidden gems of history in your own town or your own village or your own city. Share those small facts with me. And if you find something interesting, or if you have something interesting that happened in your town, send them to me by email, Facebook message, leave a comment, contact me through the website, and don't be surprised if I enlist you to help create a new episode. But let's wrap up this whole episode and this whole topic by bringing our focus back to Bishop John Carroll, the man who helped give shape to the Catholic Church in the United States. His era would close with both incredible expansion and some really deeply rooted challenges. During the later part of Carroll's tenure, the United States was growing super fast. The country wasn't just gaining people, it was gaining land at an unprecedented rate. One of the most significant additions came in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, which nearly doubled the size of the country. This expansion brought in many new Catholics, though they weren't newly converted believers. These were the descendants of the French, the people who had been Catholic for generations. Many had intermarried with Native Americans, and there were already well-established urban Catholic centers like New Orleans, complete with their own bishops and clergy. But along with this growth came big problems. 3, really, maybe 4, depending on how you slice it. First was size. The country was vast and people were scattered across huge distances. Second, there was a shortage of priests. There just wasn't enough clergy to serve this growing flock. Third, there was a real disconnect between urban and rural parishes. The resources, leadership, and influence was really lopsided, and tied into that was money, or more accurately, the lack of it, especially in the countryside. And all of these issues overlapped. The sheer geographic spread of Catholics only made the priest shortage worse. Priests rode the circuit, traveling long distances to serve small pockets of Catholics. They rarely saw their congregants regularly and had a real weak connection not only to their community, but also to their hierarchy. Carroll and the other bishops tried to solve the clergy shortage by recruiting from Europe. A number of French clergy arrived, some fleeing the French revolutions, others, well, let's just say Roman and European bishops sometimes saw America as a great place to send their problematic priests. Some of these clergy were rigorists, men who didn't understand American culture. They took hard-line stances on things like dancing and alcohol consumption. For example, dancing was scandalous to some of these priests, and alcohol, that was even more controversial. But this was early America, and we're talking about a country where it was just swimming in alcohol. Apples were primarily grown for making hard cider, not for keeping the doctor away. Alcohol was a major part of daily life for most Americans. Then on the other end of the spectrum from these rigorists, some of the priests who came or were sent were mentally unstable, alcoholic, or even sexual predators. America, it seemed, attracted all types. Then there was the issue of parish governance and finances. In some cities, Catholic parishes had plenty of money. These parishes were run by boards of trustees, lay people who didn't want oversight from a bishop locally or all the way in Baltimore. That meant John Carroll had little control over some of the most influential churches. Meanwhile, rural churches were broke. There was no infrastructure, no funding for buildings, no salaries for clergy. And Rome didn't help much either. On one hand, they micromanaged, often undercutting Carroll's authority. On the other hand, they were hands off when support was actually needed. And to be fair to Rome and the popes, there was chaos in Europe, and this contributed to these disconnections. The church in Rome and in Europe was navigating its own crises. Still, new bishoprics were formed during Carroll's tenure. Bardstown, Kentucky became one of the first. That's significant because Kentucky was a destination for early Catholic migrants. It was rich in land and resources and really not too far from Virginia and Maryland. Other bishoprics were set up in Boston, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and through the Louisiana Purchase, New Orleans. But Carroll had a complicated relationship with Rome. He was distrustful, and often for good reason. The bishops in these new dioceses were installed directly by Rome, not chosen by local synods or appointed through Carroll's authority as Archbishop of Baltimore. Meanwhile, American Catholic women began to play a prominent role. One of the most important figures in this story was Elizabeth Bailey Seton. Originally an Episcopalian, she converted to Catholicism upon her husband's death. She devoted her life to helping the poor, founded the Sisters of Charity, which exists to this day, and played a key role in building up the Catholic school system. There's some historical debate about whether she owned slaves. Her grandfather certainly did, and it's possible she may have, although probably not. The jury is really out on that, and there's a lot of really good scholarship and deep scholarship on that issue. Probably no, but they're still looking and still figuring. Regardless of all that, she was canonized in 1975, becoming the first American-born saint. As Bishop Carroll's life drew to a close, the country was pulled into yet another conflict, the War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence. Some say it was a resounding British victory. Others say it was a major American win that cemented U.S. independence once and for all. Personally, I think it was more of a draw, but one that profoundly shaped how Americans saw themselves. It marked a new era of national identity. If you want to dive deeper into the War of 1812, there's an excellent series on it, podcast series on it called on James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast, and it was co-hosted by me. So if you want to hear me follow along on that story, definitely join in and look for links in the description. As for Carroll himself, he wasn't a big fan of the war at first, even though he was a Federalist, or the party that was pro-war, politically speaking. But once the war began, he supported the effort. In the end, I think it's fair to say that John Carroll didn't just plant the seeds for the Catholic Church in America. He helped invent a truly American version of Catholicism in a time where a lot of truly American institutions were being formed. So we'll continue following that story as we move closer and closer to one of the most pivotal moments in U.S. history, the year of 1861.
Historical Jesus podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.